Because in the end, the issue is how we get our economy back producing again. In addition, ambiguity is terrible. And this is one of the problems I know talking to small business leaders in the kind of world from a leadership perspective. Whether you think the health care program is a good thing or bad thing, cap and trade is a good thing or bad thing, union checkoff is a good thing or bad thing, you do not introduce ambiguity in the middle of a crisis. Markets do not deal well with ambiguity. And one of the reasons we're struggling is that trying to run a business, what do all these things mean to us? And ambiguity is really hurting the economic environment. Long term, the most fundamental issue to me is the attack on capitalism. The United States has been successful because we've had a freer market than anywhere in the world. This is not a failure of capitalism. This is a failure of government policies caused by the Federal Reserve, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, and other related government policies. What we need is not more regulation, but freer markets. The attack on the wealthy is also an attack on the productive. Not that every wealthy person is productive, but a lot of productive people are wealthy. And we have a huge psychological attack on the wealthy, i.e. the productive. What does that mean? People become more conservative, more cautious, less motivated. And we're seeing that in spades. Roosevelt did that, by the way, during the 1930s. And it's clear that that extended the Depression. It made people less willing to take risk. And that's exactly what's going on. It's good politics, terrible economics. Long term, we absolutely have to privatize Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. They will continue to be politicized. The way we do that is make loans in the banking system. Canadian banks and Canadian economies have many less problems than the U.S. Mostly, one of the big reasons, because their banks have done home financing for years. They made those, 30-year mortgages with 20% down and had very low losses. They didn't have a Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae to compete with. If I were in charge, and I'm not going to be in charge, I would certainly look at a market-based monetary system, a private banking system. Probably it would end up being based on gold, not because there's anything magical about gold, but because you can't print it. It's hard to find, expensive to dig up. As long as we continue to have a Federal Reserve, we will get in financial trouble someday. Central monetary authorities have consistently debased the currency, and that will probably happen in the long term. If you're not going to get rid of the Fed, and they're not, what we ought to do is force discipline on the Fed, which Milton Friedman, another great free market economist, said. Let's grow the money supply at 3%. Don't let them micromanage. They had a 100% error rate in my 40-year career in banking and micromanaging the money supply. Just make them grow it at a fixed rate, which is analogous to kind of a money supply and takes out politics out of the process. If they won't do that, take the risk away from the taxpayer and put it back on the shareholders of banks. Require banks to have more capital, so if something goes wrong, the shareholders take the losses, not the taxpayers. At the same time, however, you've got to eliminate or reduce FDIC insurance. You've got to make sure the Fed can't bail out General Electric, and you've got to eliminate about 95% of bank regulations, or the industry can't be efficient. And if without a healthy banking industry, you cannot have a healthy economy. Now, they're doing the exactly opposite of this. They're putting a massive set of regulations, which is going to make the industry less efficient and reduce our long-term productivity. We need to stop subsidizing housing, reduce all government spending as a percentage of GDP, have low neutral tax rates, tax consumption, not savings. We do need free trade. I know a lot of conservatives are against free trade. In the United States started a tariff war in the 1930s in the Taft-Hartley Agreement. Everybody else responded, and it was one of the reasons the Depression lasted so long and was so deep. We need to carefully and systematically privatize Freddie Mac and Medicare and Social Security, because we have huge deficits in both those programs. We need to cut the cost of defense by defending the United States. We have plenty of military weapons. What we lack is moral certainty. We also need to encourage immigration. We have an interesting problem with the retirement of the baby boomer generation. As people get older, they get less productive. People talk about the struggle Japan has had over the last 10 years. If you look at their economy, it's not the economic policies. They got a big demographic problem. They're getting many, many more old people, and that's a big economic issue. We need to restore discipline to the system, save more and spend less. As interesting as economic issues are, far, far more important than the philosophical issues. And I want to share some thoughts with you on this. The real cause of the financial crisis is a combination of altruism and pragmatism. Where did affordable housing come from? Everybody has a right to a house, provided by who? Everybody has a right to free medical care, provided by who? My right to free medical care is my right to enslave a doctor to provide me that medical care, or enslave somebody else to pay for that doctor. That is an inversion of the American concept of rights. In the American concept of rights, each of us has a moral right to what we produce, what we create, not what somebody else produces, not what somebody else creates. Altruism leads to a redistribution from the productive to the non-productive, and it basically says no one has a right to their own life. Interesting thing happens in business. You can't really be an altruist. So business kind of back up philosophies to become a pragmatist. And pragmatists do what work, right? The dilemma is a lot of things work in the short term that are very destructive in the long term. Negative amortization mortgages, pick-a payment mortgages worked for years and then became a disaster. Also, if you're a pragmatist, you can't be rational, because rationality requires a long-term perspective, and you can't have integrity, because integrity requires a long-term perspective. You combine altruism with pragmatism, you get something I call the free lunch mentality. You look at Social Security and Medicare, huge deficits, and yet neither political candidate last year running for president offered any real solutions, and if they had, they wouldn't have been elected, right? That free lunch mentality leads to a lack of personal responsibility, which is classically the death of democracies. Founding fathers talked about the tyranny of the majority. They didn't like democracy. They founded a republic based on individual rights. They were afraid of democracy. They were afraid of the tyranny of the majority. They were talking about the abuse of individual rights, specifically freedom of speech, freedom of religion. But they also recognized that when 51% of the people realized they can get a free lunch from 49%, party over. Then 60% want a free lunch from 40%, and 70% want a free lunch from 30%, and the 30% quit. The cure is also philosophical, and it's fundamental principles that have made America great in the first place. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Each individual's moral right to their own life. Each individual's moral right to the product of their own labor, including if they produce a lot, and including the right to give it away if they want to whoever they want to on whatever terms they want to. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness demands personal responsibility because there is no free lunch. It also demands and rewards rationality and self-discipline. The United States was the only country ever founded on the idea that people should act in their rational self-interest, what I call properly understood. Properly understood. That people shouldn't take advantage of other people. That doesn't work because people don't trust you, and also it's psychologically destructive. But you also shouldn't really self-sacrifice because you have the moral right to your own life. And the proper moral code in that kind of environment is the trader principle. And the trader principle is a concept that they're really trying to get better together. In our business, we help our clients achieve economic success and financial security. They let us make a profit doing it. We get better together. And life is really about creating win-win relationships. Whenever we get greedy and try to set up a win-lose, our partner's going to get bitter, and we're going to end up with a lose-lose. Whenever we get self-sacrificial and set up a lose-win, we're going to get bitter, and we're going to end up in lose-lose relationships. So life is really about creating win-win relationships, and that's what business is about, creating win-win relationships, and that's a moral code that underlies a free market. My favorite book by far is a book called Atlas Shrugged, written by Ayn Rand in 1957. If you hadn't read it, you ought to read it. If you hadn't read it recently, you ought to read it again. Rand wrote the book to prevent what she was predicting from happening. Unfortunately, it is happening 50-something years later, and it's a very interesting insight to the long-term consequences of where we're going. What's happening in the terms of the economic environment? In the short term, I believe that we are in an economic recovery. I guess that there's some risk to the double dip, but we're probably in an economic recovery. What it probably looks like, unfortunately, is a period where we start having some real growth, but we start having more inflation, and we continue to have relatively high levels of unemployment. And that's generally termed something like stagflation, very similar to what we had in the 1970s. As interesting as that is, the real issue to me is the long term. And this really depends on us. If we continue altruism, pragmatism, free lunch mentality, the United States faces some very significant economic issues. We have huge actuarial liabilities in Social Security. We have huge actuarial liabilities in Medicare. We have huge actuarial liabilities in unfunded state and local pension funds. The combination of all that's over $100 trillion. We're operating with over $1 trillion annual operating deficits. We have a dysfunctional foreign policy. We have a real big problem with the retirement of the baby boomers, and we have a failed K-12 education system. It's a real challenge, a real challenge. In fact, it reminds me a lot of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. I told you that story. We could run the numbers. If you run the numbers in the United States in 20, 25 years, we go broke. Now, countries don't go broke by going bankrupt. They go broke by printing money, hyperinflation, or they become third world economies like Argentina. In fact, if you wanted to say what's the most likely scenario if we don't change direction 20, 25 years from now, we look like Argentina, a third world economy. We can change direction. We can fix these things, but it's almost exactly the opposite direction for what we're going in. We don't need more government regulation. We don't need more interference in the marketplace. We need to